October wind cut through Red Fern Ridge like a blade through butter, carrying whispers that made sensible folks lock their doors early. In the schoolhouse where Abigail Wynne had taught 8 long winters alone, shadows danced across empty desks like ghosts of all the children she'd never held. Tomorrow, she'd sign papers that would change everything. A marriage contract with Boaz Cutter, practical as splitting firewood and twice as necessary. No pretty words or moonlight promises, just security against the harsh Wyoming territory and maybe, if Providence smiled, the family she'd stopped hoping for. But tonight, 3 strangers with Eastern accents had been asking questions about property lines and inheritance rights, their eyes cold as January frost. Old-timers muttered about claim jumpers and blood money, while Boaz's hired hand, Jake Morrison, kept glancing toward the cemetery like a man expecting trouble. Something darker than winter was coming to Red Fern Ridge, and Abigail's marriage contract might be the only thing standing between her dreams and a grave beside the schoolhouse. What secrets were buried beneath the snow, and who was digging them up? Snow fell thick on Red Fern Ridge the morning Abigail Wynne became a married woman, but it weren't the weather that set her teeth on edge. The schoolhouse ceremony had been simple enough, just her, Boaz Cutter, and a handful of neighbors witnessing words that would bind 2 practical souls together for whatever time the frontier allowed them. But them 3 strangers lurking by the cemetery gates had turned what should have been a quiet celebration into something that felt more like a wake. "Mighty fine ceremony, miss. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Cutter," old Hank muttered from behind the makeshift bar he'd set up near the schoolhouse stove. The bartender's weathered hands shook as he poured whiskey into shot glasses lined up like soldiers, spilling more amber liquid than made it into the glass. "But them fellas by the graveyard been asking some peculiar questions about property lines and such." Abigail's fingers tightened on her new husband's arm. Still strange thinking of Boaz that way, though she reckoned she'd get used to it in time. She'd signed that marriage contract for security, for a chance at the family she'd stopped believing would ever come her way after 8 long winters of teaching other folks' children. The arrangement suited them both. She needed protection from the territory's harsh realities, and he needed someone to tend his home while he worked the ranch. No romance, no pretty promises, just honest partnership written out in careful script and witnessed proper. But why's my heart racing like a spooked Mustang? The thought came unbidden as she watched the strangers through frost-covered windows, their expensive eastern coats standing out like ravens among sparrows. What sort of questions? Boaz's voice carried the quiet strength that had first caught her attention when he'd walked into her schoolroom 6 weeks ago with his straightforward proposal. No beating around the bush with Boaz Cutter. He'd stated his need for a wife like he was discussing cattle prices, and she'd appreciated his honesty more than any flowery courtship. Hank's roomy eyes darted toward the cemetery, then back to his bottles. "Oh, you know, who owns what? How long folks been settled? Whether there's any irregularities in the land grants? That sort of Eastern lawyer talk that makes honest folks nervous." Jake Morrison, Boaz's hired hand, shifted uncomfortably near the door, his calloused fingers worrying the brim of his worn hat. The young man had been acting skittish all morning, jumping at shadows and avoiding direct eye contact. Something's eating at that boy, Abigail thought, her teacher's instincts picking up on his distress. But what's got him so spooked? Irregularities? Boaz's jaw tightened, and Abigail felt tension ripple through his frame like a wire pulled taut. "My daddy settled this land legal and proper 20 years ago. Ain't no irregularities about it." "Course not," Hank said quickly, but his voice carried doubt like a man walking on thin ice. Well, them strangers got papers of their own, and they've been mighty interested in the old courthouse records. One of 'em even asked about your daddy specifically, Boaz. Wanted to know about his circumstances." The word hung in the air like gun smoke, heavy with unspoken implications. Abigail knew the story. Most folks in Red Fern Ridge did. Thomas Cutter had died in what everyone called an accident, thrown from his horse during a terrible storm 20 years past. Boaz had been just 13 then, left to work the ranch with nothing but grit and determination to keep from losing everything his father had built. Why would strangers be asking about ancient history? Maria Santos, the Mexican-American woman who'd become one of Abigail's few close friends over the years, moved closer to the group. Her dark eyes held worry as she adjusted her colorful rebozo against the cold. My grandmother used to say, "Cuando los cuervos vuelan en círculos, alguien va a morir." When ravens circle, someone dies. Maybe these strangers are like ravens, looking for something dead to pick clean. Maria, Abigail said gently, though her friend's words sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the October chill. I know. Old superstitions. But sometimes the old ways see truths the new ways miss. Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My Pedro saw one of them strangers yesterday, counting off steps from the cemetery to your ranch house, Boaz, like he was measuring something. Jake Morrison's hat brim crumpled under his nervous grip. The young man looked like he was wrestling with words that wanted to come out, but couldn't quite make it past his teeth. What's he hiding? Abigail wondered, her new concern for Boaz extending to worry about his clearly troubled employee. Jake? Boaz's voice carried gentle authority. You got something to say about this? The hired hand's Adam's apple bobbed like a cork in choppy water. Well, boss, I seen them strangers, too. One of them asked me yesterday if I knew anything about the old Cutter claim, whether there might be any disputes over ownership. I told him to mind their own business, but he trailed off, eyes fixed on his boots. But what? The steel in Boaz's voice could have cut glass, but they seemed mighty sure they had a right to be asking, like they knew something we don't. The schoolhouse fell silent except for the whisper of snow against windows and the crackle of wood in the stove. Abigail felt her new husband's muscles coil like a spring under her touch, and she realized with sudden clarity that whatever security she'd thought this marriage would bring might be as fragile as frost on glass. Through the window, she watched the three strangers mount expensive horses and ride toward town, their movements unhurried and confident. One of them, a tall man with silver at his temples, turned in his saddle to look back at the schoolhouse, and even through the frost-covered pane, Abigail could feel the weight of his cold appraisal. We're being hunted. The thought came sharp and certain. But why? Boaz, she said quietly, her teacher's voice steady, despite the fear crawling up her spine. What ain't you telling me about this land? Her new husband's hand covered hers, warm and reassuring despite the calluses that spoke of hard labor and harder choices. Nothing you need to worry about, Abigail. This ranch has been Cutter land since before statehood, and it'll stay Cutter land long after we're both in the ground beside my daddy. But even as he spoke the words, Jake Morrison was staring out the window with the look of a man watching storm clouds gather on a clear day, and Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that her practical marriage had just become the most dangerous gamble of her life. Come morning, them questions would have answers, whether they wanted them or not. The answers came riding into Red Fern Ridge at first light, dressed in a tailored coat that cost more than most folks saw in a year, and flanked by two men who had the look of hired trouble about them. Marcus Blackwood sat his expensive bay gelding like a man who owned everything his eyes touched, and from the cold smile playing at his lips, that's exactly what he believed. Abigail stood beside Boaz on the porch of their ranch house, still getting used to the word. One night of marriage hadn't changed much except the name on her papers, but watching this stranger approach with the confidence of a man collecting a debt, she felt protective instincts rise up fierce as a mama bear defending cubs. Mr. Cutter, Marcus called out as he reined in his horse, voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education mixed with something sharper underneath. I believe we have business to discuss. Legal business. Boaz's hand settled on Abigail's lower back, a gesture that might have looked casual to watching eyes but carried the weight of a promise. I'll protect what's mine. The thought seemed to flow between them without words, and Abigail found herself standing straighter, drawing strength from his quiet resolve. Don't believe we've been introduced, Boaz said, his voice level as a carpenter's rule but carrying undertones that would make wise men step careful. And I can't think of any legal business I got with Eastern dandies. Marcus's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his pale eyes. Marcus Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood estate. And I'm afraid you're quite mistaken about our business, Mr. Cutter. You see, I've recently discovered some rather disturbing irregularities regarding the ownership of this property. The two men flanking him shifted in their saddles, hands resting casual-like near their gun belts. Not an open threat, but not exactly friendly either. Abigail's schoolteacher instincts cataloged details: expensive leather holsters, well-maintained weapons, eyes that never stopped moving. These weren't lawyers. They were enforcers dressed up fancy. What kind of irregularities? The question came from Jake Morrison, who'd appeared from the barn with the nervous energy of a cat in a thunderstorm. His young face was pale beneath his hat brim, and Abigail noticed how his gaze kept flicking between Marcus and the riders, like he was calculating odds he didn't much like. The kind that suggests the original land grant may have been improperly obtained. Marcus reached into his coat with deliberate slowness, producing a sheaf of official-looking papers. My father, God rest his soul, was Thomas Cutter's business partner before his untimely demise. According to these documents, he had legitimate claim to half this property. Business partner. Abigail's mind raced. In all the stories she'd heard about Boaz's father, no one had ever mentioned a partner. But then again, 20 years was a long time, and frontier memories could be as changeable as prairie weather. Your daddy never mentioned no partner to me, Boaz said, but there was something in his voice, a hairline crack of uncertainty that made Abigail's stomach clench. Thomas Cutter worked this land alone till the day he died. Ah, but that's where you're wrong. Marcus's voice took on the tone of a schoolmaster correcting a particularly slow student, and Abigail bristled at the condescension. My father's records are quite detailed. Surveying maps, shared expenses, even correspondence discussing future plans for the property. All properly witnessed and notarized, I assure you. From behind them came the sound of approaching horses, neighbors drawn by the commotion, or maybe just the instinct that told frontier folks when trouble was brewing. Abigail recognized the steady clip-clop of Maria Santos's old mare, followed by the heavier hoofbeats that meant Tom Brady, the deputy sheriff, was riding hard. Papers can lie as easy as men, Maria called out as she dismounted, her reboso whipping in the cold wind. Especially papers that show up 20 years after the fact, when the folks who might contradict them are safe in their graves. Marcus turned his cold attention to the older woman, and Abigail saw his jaw tighten at being challenged by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. I beg your pardon, Senora, but legal documents carry considerably more weight than frontier gossip. Watch your tongue when you're speaking to Mrs. Santos, Tom Brady growled as he swung down from his horse. The deputy's hand rested easy on his gun butt, and there was nothing friendly in his weathered face. She's got more integrity in her little finger than most Eastern lawyers got in their whole bodies. The tension crackling between the two groups felt thick enough to cut with a blade. Abigail found herself stepping forward, her teacher's instincts for diffusing classroom confrontations kicking in before she could think better of it. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 8 years of managing unruly children and uncertain parents. Assuming for a moment that your papers are legitimate, which I'm not saying they are, what exactly are you proposing? Something like approval flickered in Marcus's eyes, as if he'd finally found someone worth addressing. A reasonable woman, how refreshing. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. I'm proposing nothing, Mrs. Cutter. I'm simply informing you that this property legally belongs to the Blackwood estate. However, I'm prepared to be generous, in my terms, for relocating. Generous? Boaz's voice carried dangerous quiet. Mighty kind of you to be generous with my own land. Your land? Marcus laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. My dear man, I'm afraid sentiment doesn't supersede legal documentation. This property was fraudulently claimed after my father's death, and I intend to see justice done. Jake Morrison made a sound like a man taking a punch to the gut, and when Abigail glanced his way, she saw sweat beading on his forehead despite the October cold. What's got him so rattled? The boy looked like he was wrestling with words that wanted to come out but couldn't quite make it past his throat. Justice? Tom Brady spat into the dirt, his disgust evident. Justice would be you turning that fancy horse around and riding back to whatever rock you crawled out from under. Folks around here know the truth about Thomas Cutter, and it ain't got nothing to do with mysterious partners showing up 2 decades late. For the first time, Marcus's composure cracked slightly, and Abigail caught a glimpse of something ugly beneath the civilized veneer. I'm afraid the truth, Deputy, is what these documents say it is. And what they say is that my family has been cheated out of valuable property for 20 years. Your family? Maria's voice carried sharp interest. What was your daddy's name, this supposed partner? Jonathan Blackwood. He and Thomas Cutter were equal partners in developing this land until… Marcus paused, his pale eyes fixing on Boaz with something that might have been calculation or might have been cruelty. Until Thomas met with his unfortunate accident. The way he said accident made it sound like anything but, and Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind cutting across the prairie. Accident. The word seemed to hang in the air like a noose, loaded with implications she didn't want to consider. You callin' my daddy's death something other than accident? Boaz's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt, and Abigail saw Marcus's hired men tense in response. Gentlemen, she said sharply, stepping between the two groups before someone made a mistake they couldn't take back. I believe we've heard enough legal theory for one morning. Mr. Blackwood, if you truly believe you have legitimate claim to this property, then I suggest you file your papers with the territorial court and let proper authorities sort this out. Marcus's smile returned, cold and predatory. Oh, Mrs. Cutter, I fully intend to pursue this through all proper channels, but I thought it only sporting to give you fair warning before the legal proceedings begin. After all, it would be such a shame to see a newly married couple displaced, without adequate time to prepare. The threat was as clear as mountain air, and Abigail felt anger rise in her chest like floodwater. 8 years of frontier teaching had given her a backbone made of hickory and a tongue that could flay the hide off a mule when circumstances called for it. How very considerate of you, she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. And it's equally considerate of us to warn you that frontier hospitality has its limits, especially when it comes to carpetbaggers making threats against honest folks. Marcus's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through leather. Y'all having a party without inviting the neighbors? Everyone turned to see Iron Pete Morrison riding up with 3 of his ranch hands, their horses breathing steam in the cold air. Pete was a big man, with hands like ham hocks, and a reputation for settling disputes with his fists when words failed. But what caught Abigail's attention was the way Jake Morrison went pale as fresh snow when he saw the newcomers. Morrison, the same name. Are they kin? Pete, Boaz nodded carefully. The 2 ranchers had never been friendly, but they'd maintained an uneasy peace based on mutual respect for property lines and common sense. Heard there was some discussion about land ownership, Pete said, his eyes fixing on Marcus with undisguised hostility. Figured I'd ride over and make sure my neighbors weren't being troubled by… unwelcome visitors. Marcus studied the new arrivals with the calculating gaze of a man reassessing his odds. 6 armed men against his 2 enforcers. Even Eastern money couldn't buy those kinds of numbers. How touching, Marcus said finally. Such community spirit. But I'm afraid community sentiment doesn't alter legal reality. This land belongs to the Blackwood estate, and I will have it back. He gathered his reins with the air of a man making strategic retreat rather than surrender. I'll be staying at the hotel in town while I complete the necessary paperwork. I do hope you'll use this time to consider my generous offer of relocation assistance. As he wheeled his horse toward town, his parting words carried across the yard like a curse. Oh, and Mr. Cutter, you might want to ask your hired hand about the conversation we had yesterday. I believe Jake has some interesting insights about family loyalty. The implications hit like a physical blow. Abigail saw Jake Morrison's face crumple with shame and fear, saw Iron Pete's expression harden with something that might have been disappointment or might have been fury. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Jake Morrison and Iron Pete Morrison, family, and Jake had been talking to Marcus Blackwood. But them papers Marcus waved around weren't the only secrets hiding in Red Fern Ridge. The truth came crawling out of shadows like a wounded animal, bleeding secrets that had been buried for 20 long years. Abigail found herself sitting cross-legged on the rough wooden floor of Boaz's, their parlor, surrounded by dusty boxes that hadn't been opened since his father's death. The marriage contract might have given her legal right to be here, but it was the desperate need to understand Marcus Blackwood's claims that drove her to dig through memories that weren't hers to claim. "Shouldn't be doing this without you," she murmured to the empty room, knowing Boaz was out checking fence lines with Tom Brady, making sure Marcus's hired guns hadn't been trespassing during the night. But waiting felt like swallowing live coals, and Abigail had never been one to sit idle when action was called for. The first box held nothing but old bills of sale for cattle and supplies, the mundane paperwork of frontier life. The second contained her late father-in-law's few personal effects, a worn Bible, a tintype of a woman who must have been Boaz's mother, and a leather journal filled with observations about weather, cattle, and the endless struggle to make something lasting from unforgiving land. It was in the third box, tucked beneath a stack of territorial newspapers yellow with age, that she found it. The letter was written in Thomas Cutter's careful hand. She recognized it from comparing it to the journal, but the words it contained made her blood run cold as January wind. If something happens to me, folks need to know the truth about Jonathan Blackwood. The man's got murder in his heart and greed in his soul, and I fear I've made an enemy that won't rest till one of us is dead. He's been pressuring me to sell out, threatening my boy if I don't give him what he wants. But this land is Boaz's birthright, and I'll die before I let that snake take it from him. J. Blackwood came by again today with his lawyer talk and his veiled threats. Says he's got papers that prove we was partners, but I never signed nothing with that man except his death warrant if he comes near my family again. If you're reading this and I'm in the ground, you'll know it weren't no accident that put me there. Tell my boy I'm sorry I couldn't protect him better. Tell him the land is his, earned with honest sweat and paid for with honest blood. And tell him to watch out for Blackwood's spawn. Snakes breed snakes, and this family's poison runs deep. God forgive me for the violence I'm thinking, but some men only understand lead and steel. Thomas Cutter, October 15th, 1854. The letter trembled in Abigail's hands like a living thing, each word hitting her conscience like hammer blows. Murder, not accident, murder, and Marcus Blackwood was the son of the man who'd killed her husband's father. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she whispered, her school teacher's vocabulary failing her completely. 20 years of lies, 20 years of Boaz carrying guilt for not protecting a father who'd been murdered by the very family now claiming his land. The sound of horses approaching sent her scrambling to her feet, letter clutched against her chest like armor. Through the window she could see Boaz riding hard toward the house, Tom Brady beside him, and behind them, Jake Morrison, his young face pale as death and his eyes holding the kind of fear that came from watching your world fall apart, piece by piece. They burst through the door like men fleeing a prairie fire, bringing cold air and urgent voices. "Abigail!" Boaz's eyes found her immediately, relief and concern warring in his weathered features. "Thank God you're safe." "We found sign of riders near the south pasture, at least 6 men, moving careful-like and watching the house." "More than watching," Tom added grimly, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Found where they'd been camping for days, maybe weeks. Professional job, covered their tracks, buried their fire pits, cleaned up after themselves like soldiers." Jake Morrison remained by the door, shifting from foot to foot like a man standing on hot coals. His eyes kept darting to the letter in Abigail's hands, and she saw something that looked like recognition flicker across his features. He knows, she realized with sudden certainty. Whatever's in this letter, Jake Morrison already knows about it. "Boaz," she said quietly, extending the letter toward him with hands that had somehow stopped shaking. "I think you need to read this. I think we all need to read this." The silence that followed was thick as molasses and twice as dark. Boaz took the letter with the reverence a man might show handling a loaded gun, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting of a father who'd been dead half his lifetime. She watched his face change as he read, watched 20 years of self-blame and guilt transform into something harder and more dangerous. When he looked up, his eyes held the kind of cold fury that could freeze blood in a man's veins. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than shouting ever could. "Son of a murdering, lying, thieving bitch." Tom Brady read over his shoulder, the deputy's weathered face growing darker with each line. "This changes everything, Boaz. If Thomas was murdered—" "If?" Boaz's voice cracked like a whip. "You think my daddy was lying when he wrote that? You think he made up threats against his own boy just for the entertainment of it?" No, that ain't what I meant." Tom held up placating hands. "I meant if we can prove it." "Letter like this, written by a dead man. It's evidence, but it ain't proof that would stand up in court." "Court?" Jake Morrison's voice came out as a strangled croak. "Y'all talking about taking this to court?" All eyes turned to the young man, and Abigail saw him wilt under the collective attention like a flower in desert sun. The fear in his face was so stark, so desperate, that her heart went out to him despite her growing suspicions about his loyalties. "Jake," she said gently, using the same tone she'd use with a frightened child. "What do you know about this? What ain't you telling us?" The hired hand's composure cracked like ice in spring thaw. "Mrs. Cutter, I never meant— God help me, I never thought it would come to this." "Come to what?" Boaz's voice carried dangerous quiet. "Jake Morrison, you better start talking plain, because my patience is wearing thinner than paper, and my daddy's letter says I got good reason to be suspicious of folks keeping secrets." Jake's hat fell from nerveless fingers as he slumped against the door frame. Iron Pete Morrison is my older brother. Raised me after our folks died in a range war down in Texas. Everything I am, I owe to him." The admission hit the room like a thunderclap. Abigail felt pieces clicking together in her mind. Jake's nervous behavior around Iron Pete, his obvious discomfort during yesterday's confrontation, the way he'd gone pale when Pete arrived with his riders. "Your brother," Tom said slowly. "And yesterday, when Marcus Blackwood mentioned family loyalty—" "Pete's been talking to Blackwood," Jake whispered, the words torn from him like confession under torture. "Been meeting with him for weeks, discussing arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Boaz's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt, and Abigail saw Jake flinch as if he'd been struck. "The kind where Pete gets a piece of this ranch if he helps Blackwood prove his claim." Jake's voice was barely audible. "Pete's been struggling, boss. His spread ain't been profitable for years, and he's got debts piling up like cordwood. Blackwood offered him a way out, help discredit your daddy's claim, and he'd get a percentage of the land value. And you? Abigail's question cut through the room like a blade. Where do your loyalties lie, Jake Morrison? The young man's eyes filled with tears that he was too proud to let fall. I don't know, Mrs. Cutter. God help me, I just don't know anymore. The sound of approaching horses saved him from having to elaborate. Through the window, Abigail could see Maria Santos riding hard toward the house, her rebozo streaming behind her like a battle flag. Behind her came Clara Santos, Maria's grown daughter, and both women had the look of folks bearing urgent news. Trouble coming, Tom observed, moving toward the window. And from the look on Maria's face, it ain't the kind that waits for convenient timing. They burst through the door without ceremony, Maria's dark eyes wild with urgency. They took him, she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. Marcus Blackwood's men. They took old Hank from the saloon, said he'd been spreading lies about their employer. Took him where? Boaz demanded. Nobody knows, Clara answered, her young voice tight with fear. But before they grabbed him, Hank was telling folks about a conversation he overheard, something about forged papers and blood money. Said he had proof that would put Blackwood in prison. Proof? The word hung in the air like a loaded gun. Abigail looked at the letter in Boaz's hands, then at Jake Morrison's guilt-stricken face, and felt the last pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle sliding into place. We have to help him, she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Whatever Hank knows, whatever proof he has, we can't let Marcus silence him. Abigail's right, Tom said grimly. If Blackwood's willing to kidnap folks to keep his secrets, then we're past the point of legal niceties. This is frontier justice territory now. Jake Morrison straightened against the doorframe, and when he spoke, his voice carried new resolve. Then I reckon it's time I chose a side. Pete's my blood, but y'all are my family, and family don't let family stand alone against murdering thieves. Boaz studied the young man for a long moment, weighing 20 years of guilt against the desperate honesty in Jake's eyes. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then we best get moving. Marcus Blackwood's about to learn that frontier folks don't take kindly to kidnappers and claim jumpers. As they gathered weapons and supplies, Abigail felt something she hadn't experienced in her 8 quiet years of teaching. The fierce, protective fury of a woman defending her home. The marriage contract had given her legal right to this land, but it was the letter in her hands and the people around her that made it worth fighting for. That deed Marcus Blackwood's waving around wasn't the only secret hiding in Red Fern Ridge, and some secrets were worth killing for. The search for Hank started at dawn and ended with blood on the barn floor, but it was the secrets that spilled in between that nearly tore them apart. Jake Morrison rode point as their makeshift posse followed tracks through the pine forests north of Red Fern Ridge, his young face set in lines too hard for his years. Every hoofprint in the frost-covered earth told a story of professional kidnappers who knew their business, too professional for frontier outlaws, too careful for desperate men. These ain't just hired guns, Abigail thought as she guided her mare through the narrow trail, rifle balanced across her saddle horn. These are soldiers. But whose army are they fighting for? Trail splits here, Jake called back, reining in his sorrel gelding where the path forked around a stand of ancient pines. Main group went north toward the old mining camp, but 2 riders broke off east. Boaz studied the tracks with the focused attention of a man reading scripture. 20 years of ranching had taught him to read sign, like other folks read newspapers, and what he saw in the churned earth made his jaw tighten like a steel trap. East leads to Iron Pete's spread, he said quietly, his voice carrying implications that made everyone shift uncomfortably in their saddles. Jake's hands tightened on his reins until his knuckles showed white as bone. The family connection that had seemed like salvation yesterday now felt like a noose tightening around all their necks. Poor boys caught between blood and conscience, Abigail thought, and there ain't no good choices left for him to make. Could be coincidence, Tom Brady offered, but his deputy's badge caught morning sunlight like a lie detector and nobody believed him, least of all Tom himself. Could be, Boaz agreed with the tone of a man discussing fairy tales. Could be a lot of things. Question is, which trail do we follow? Split up, Maria Santos suggested from her position beside Clara. Mother and daughter had insisted on joining the search despite the danger, and Abigail had to admire their frontier spine. Cover more ground, find Hank faster. Split up and maybe walk into separate ambushes, Tom countered. These men took Hank for a reason, probably to draw us out into country where they got the advantage. Jake Morrison's horse danced sideways, reflecting its rider's agitation. The young man looked like he was wrestling with words that wanted to come out, but couldn't quite make it past his loyalty-torn throat. Jake, Abigail said gently, using her schoolteacher voice to cut through his internal struggle. What ain't you telling us? What do you know about where they might have taken Hank? The hired hand's Adam's apple bobbed like a cork in choppy water. There's an old line shack up near Copper Creek. Been abandoned since the mine played out, but Pete's been using it for meetings. What kind of meetings? Boaz's question carried dangerous quiet. The kind where folks discuss business they don't want overheard. Jake's voice cracked like a boy's, despite his 20-odd years. Pete's been struggling, boss. Bad winters, cattle prices down, debts piling up. When Blackwood came offering partnership, he trailed off, but the implications hung in the cold air like gun smoke. Abigail felt her heart sink as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Iron Pete Morrison wasn't just Jake's brother. He was Marcus Blackwood's local ally, bought and paid for with promises of profit from stolen land. How long? Boaz's voice could have cut glass. How long has Pete been in Blackwood's pocket? Since last spring, near as I can tell. Jake's confession came out in a rush, like water bursting through a cracked dam. Started with small things, information about cattle movements, which ranchers might be willing to sell. But when Blackwood started asking about your daddy's old papers, about who might know details of the original land grant, you told him about the boxes in the house, Abigail realized with sick certainty. You told him where Thomas kept his private papers. Jake's silence was answer enough. The weight of betrayal settled over the group like a funeral shroud, and Abigail watched 20 years of trust between Boaz and his hired hand crumble like a house built on sand. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Tom breathed. Jake, what have you done? I never meant for it to go this far. The words exploded from Jake like a gunshot, startling his horse and sending birds flying from nearby trees. Pete said it was just business. Help Blackwood establish legitimate claim. Nobody gets hurt. Everybody gets paid. I never thought about murder. Never thought about kidnapping innocent folks. But you thought about betraying the man who's fed and housed you for 3 years, Boaz said with quiet devastation. You thought about that just fine. The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow, and Abigail saw tears gather in his eyes, tears he was too proud and too ashamed to let fall. He's just a boy, she thought despite her anger. A boy caught between impossible loyalties and grown men's greed. Boaz, she said quietly, reaching across the space between their horses to touch his arm. We can hash out betrayals later. Right now, Hank's life depends on us making the right choice. Her husband, still strange thinking that, took a breath that seemed to carry 20 years of weight, then nodded once. The gesture was sharp and decisive, cutting through emotion to focus on what mattered most. North to the mining camp, he decided. If they wanted Jake to lead us to Pete's line shack, they wouldn't have made it so obvious. This whole trail split might be misdirection. Or they want us divided, Maria added with the wisdom of someone who'd survived frontier life through careful thinking rather than quick guns. Weakened and easier to handle. As they turned their horses toward the northern trail, Jake Morrison called out with desperate urgency, "Boss, wait! There's something else. Something I ain't told you yet." The group reined in, and Abigail felt tension coil in her stomach like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. More secrets. How many more secrets can one young man carry? "Blackwood's got more than forged papers," Jake said, his voice barely audible above the wind through the pines. "He's got witnesses, folks who'll swear they saw Thomas Cutter sign partnership agreements with Jonathan Blackwood. Folks who'll testify that your daddy cheated Pete's daddy out of his rightful share." "Bought witnesses," Tom spat with disgust. "Maybe, or maybe." Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. "Maybe some of them old-timers actually believe what they're saying. 20 years is a long time, and memories get fuzzy when there's money involved." The implications of that statement settled over them like a cold fog. Even if they could prove Jonathan Blackwood had murdered Thomas Cutter, Marcus might still win in court through sheer weight of manufactured evidence and convenient witnesses. "Then we don't let it get to court," Abigail heard herself say, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "We find Hank, we get the truth, and we settle this the frontier way." "Abigail," Boaz said carefully, "you talking about vigilante justice?" She met his eyes steadily, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. 8 years of teaching children and tending gardens had been peaceful enough, but this was about protecting home and family and everything worth fighting for. "I'm talking about defending what's ours against thieves and murderers," she said quietly, same as any frontier woman would do when her family's threatened. The sound of distant gunfire cut through the morning air like thunder, coming from the direction of the mining camp. 3 shots, evenly spaced. Either someone was in trouble, or someone was signaling. "Move," Boaz commanded, spurring his horse toward the sound. "Whatever's happening up there, we're gonna be too late if we don't ride hard." They thundered through the forest in single file, horses breathing steam in the cold air as hooves pounded against frost-hard earth. Abigail found herself riding harder than she'd ever ridden in her life. Her teacher's skirts hiked up practical-like, and her rifle ready for whatever they might find. Behind her, she could hear Jake Morrison keeping pace, and despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies and the family loyalty that had nearly gotten them all killed, she found herself hoping the boy would choose the right side when the shooting started. Because shooting was coming, sure as winter follows fall. The mining camp appeared ahead through the trees like a ghost of better times. Collapsed buildings and rusted equipment scattered across a clearing that had once buzzed with the dreams of men seeking fortune in the earth. Now it looked like a graveyard for ambitions, and in the center of it all stood a figure that made Abigail's blood run cold. Marcus Blackwood waited beside the old mine office, his expensive coat immaculate despite the rough country, his pale eyes fixed on their approaching group with the satisfied smile of a spider watching flies enter its web. And at his feet, bound and bloodied but still breathing, lay old Hank, the price of asking too many questions about buried secrets. "Welcome," Marcus called out as they reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't accept my invitation." "Invitation?" Boaz's voice carried deadly quiet. "That what you call kidnapping an innocent man?" "Innocent?" Marcus laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Dear Mr. Cutter, there's nothing innocent about Mr. Henry Morrison. Oh yes, I know his full name. Spreading vicious lies about my family's legitimate business interests." Morrison. Abigail's heart sank as another piece clicked into place. Hank Morrison, Jake Morrison, Iron Pete Morrison. How many Morrisons are tied up in this mess? "He's my uncle," Jake whispered from beside her. the admission torn from him like confession under torture. "Hank's my daddy's older brother. He's been protecting me from Pete's arrangements by keeping quiet about what he knows." "And what does he know?" Tom Brady demanded, his deputy's badge catching sunlight like an accusation. Marcus Blackwood's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Why don't we ask him, Mr. Morrison? Would you care to share with these good people what you told me about Jonathan Blackwood's final meeting with Thomas Cutter?" Hank raised his battered head with the stubborn pride of a man who'd taken worse beatings and lived to tell about it. Blood trickled from his split lip, but his voice came clear and strong. "Told you the truth, you murdering snake. Jonathan Blackwood shot Thomas Cutter in cold blood over that land, and the whole Morrison family's been living with that secret for 20 years. The words hit the clearing like a thunderclap, and Abigail felt the last pieces of a deadly puzzle falling into place. The Morrison family, Jake, Pete, and Hank, had all known the truth about Thomas Cutter's murder, known it, and kept silent while Boaz grew up believing he'd failed to protect his father. But who else knows? And how many people have been keeping this secret to protect themselves? "Fascinating family history," Marcus said with mock politeness. "But I'm afraid Mr. Morrison's version of events differs significantly from the legal documentation in my possession. You see, my father's business records clearly show that Thomas Cutter was the aggressor in their final dispute, that he attacked Jonathan Blackwood in a drunken rage and died when my father defended himself." "That's a damn lie," Hank snarled from the ground. "I saw the whole thing from the ridge above the creek. Your daddy shot Thomas in the back while he was walking away." Marcus's composure cracked for just a moment, and Abigail caught a glimpse of the same predatory rage that must have driven his father to murder. "Careful, old man. Frontier accidents can be so unpredictable." The threat was clear as mountain air, and Abigail felt fury rise in her chest like a wildfire. She'd spent 8 years protecting children from bullies and cowards, and Marcus Blackwood was both rolled into one expensive package. "Let him go," she said, surprised by the authority in her own voice. "Let him go, and we'll discuss your claims like civilized people." "Civilized?" Marcus's laugh was ugly as a vulture's cry. "My dear Mrs. Cutter, civilization is what I'm trying to restore to this godless territory. Civilization means respecting legal documents and property rights, not frontier vigilante justice." "And murder?" Boaz's question came soft as a whisper but sharp as a blade. "What does civilization say about murdering innocent ranchers for their land? It says that sometimes good men must defend themselves against desperate criminals." Marcus's hand moved toward the gun beneath his coat with calculated slowness. "It says that when negotiation fails, other methods become necessary." The clearing erupted into chaos as 6 of Marcus's hired guns emerged from hiding among the ruined buildings, rifles trained on Abigail's group. Professional killers with dead eyes and steady hands, the kind of men who'd shoot women and children without losing sleep over it. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," Abigail realized with sick certainty, "and Marcus Blackwood's done playing games." "Now then," Marcus said with satisfaction, his civilized mask finally slipping completely away, "I believe it's time we discussed terms for your immediate departure from my property, starting with how much you value old Mr. Morrison's continued existence." Jake Morrison's hand moved toward his gun with the desperate speed of a man choosing between damnation and destruction. "Uncle Hank!" "Don't do it, boy," the old man called out. "They'll kill you sure as sunrise." But Jake was already moving, his loyalty finally choosing blood over betrayal, family over fear. His Colt cleared leather like lightning, and the first shot echoed across the clearing like Judgment Day. While they'd been questioning loyalties inside their own group, Marcus Blackwood had been positioning his pieces for checkmate, and some games could only end in blood. Jake Morrison's first shot took down Marcus Blackwood's nearest gunman before the echo finished bouncing off canyon walls. But it was Mother Nature who turned a desperate fight into hell on Earth. The spring rains that had been threatening all morning chose that moment to open up like the wrath of God, turning the mining camp's hard-packed earth into treacherous mud within minutes. Thunder crashed overhead, as if heaven itself was taking sides in the battle, and lightning split the sky like muzzle flashes from a giant's rifle. "Move!" Boaz roared over the storm, spurring his horse toward the nearest cover as bullets whined through the downpour like angry hornets. "Get to the rocks!" Abigail had never been shot at in her life, but 8 years of frontier teaching had given her nerves of steel when it came to keeping her head in chaos. She wheeled her mare toward a jumble of boulders that offered protection, rifle clutched tight against her chest, and her heart hammering like a war drum. "This ain't no schoolyard disagreement," she thought grimly as a bullet splintered wood inches from her head. "These men are trying to kill us." Jake Morrison proved his choice of loyalties by putting himself between Marcus and old Hank, his young face set in lines of desperate determination. "You want my uncle? You gotta go through me first." "With pleasure," Marcus snarled, his civilized mask torn away completely to reveal the predator beneath. His expensive coat was already soaked through, making him look like a drowned rat with delusions of grandeur. "Your family's been a thorn in my side long enough." The gunfight that followed would have made angels weep and devils cheer. Muzzle flashes strobed through the rain like deadly lightning while men scrambled for cover among the mining camp's rusted machinery. Tom Brady's deputy badge caught a bullet that would have taken his heart, sending him diving behind an overturned ore cart with a curse that could have blistered paint. But it was the sound of rushing water that made everyone pause in their deadly dance, a rumble like distant thunder that grew louder with each passing second. "The creek!" Maria Santos screamed from her position behind a fallen timber. "The creek's rising!" Copper Creek, normally a peaceful trickle that barely wet a horse's hooves, had become a raging torrent fed by mountain runoff and storm rain. The sound of its fury grew from whisper to roar as thousands of gallons of ice-cold water came rushing down the canyon like Judgment Day. "Flash flood!" Tom Brady hollered, forgetting the battle in the face of nature's greater threat. "Everyone to high ground! Now!" Marcus Blackwood's hired guns found themselves facing a choice between continuing the fight and drowning like rats in a barrel. Most chose survival over silver, scrambling toward higher ground with the desperate speed of men who'd suddenly remembered that water could kill quicker than bullets. But Marcus himself seemed caught between rage and disbelief, staring at the approaching wall of water as if he could stop it through sheer force of will. "This isn't finished!" he screamed at Boaz across the clearing. "You hear me? This isn't finished!" "Tell it to the creek!" Boaz shouted back, hauling old Hank onto his horse with strength born of desperation. The old man was barely conscious but breathing, which was more than they'd dared hope for when the shooting started. Jake Morrison grabbed his uncle's other arm, helping secure him across Boaz's saddle. "Sorry, Uncle Hank. Should have chosen better from the start." "Done is done, boy," Hank wheezed through split lips. "Question now is whether we can outrun what's coming." What was coming looked like the end of the world wrapped in brown water and debris. Trees the size of telegraph poles tumbled in the flood like matchsticks, and the roar had become so loud that shouting was nearly useless. The mining camp's lower buildings disappeared beneath the surge as if they'd never existed. "The Ridge Trail!" Clara Santos pointed toward a narrow path that switchbacked up the canyon wall like a scar across stone. "It's the only way out!" They spurred their horses toward the trail with death literally breathing down their necks. The water was rising faster than seemed possible, reaching for them with icy fingers that promised a cold grave for anyone who stumbled. Abigail's mare slipped on wet stone, recovered, slipped again. For one heart-stopping moment, she felt herself sliding toward the flood, her teacher's life flashing before her eyes in a series of quiet disappointments and small victories. Then Boaz's strong hand grabbed her reins, steadying both horse and rider with the calm competence that had first drawn her to him. "Stay with me," he said, his voice cutting through wind and water and her own fear. "We're getting out of this together." Together. The word hit her like a revelation. Not, "I'll save you," or "follow me." Together. Partnership instead of protection. And somehow that made all the difference. They climbed the treacherous trail in single file, horses breathing hard in the thin air while water raged below them like a living thing with murder on its mind. Behind them, Marcus Blackwood's remaining men struggled to follow, but the flood had scattered them like leaves in a hurricane. "There!" Maria pointed toward a shelf of rock wide enough to hold horses and riders. "We can rest the animals and plan our next move." The shelf offered blessed relief from the nightmare below, but as they dismounted and tried to catch their breath, Jake Morrison's face went pale as fresh snow. "Boss," he said quietly, pointing back down the trail. "We got company." Iron Pete Morrison was climbing toward them with grim determination, his big frame moving up the rocky path with the relentless persistence of a man who'd made his choice and intended to see it through. Behind him came 3 of his ranch hands, all armed and all wearing expressions that promised no quarter given or expected. "Pete!" Jake called down to his brother, his voice cracking with emotion. "Don't do this. Blackwood ain't worth dying for." "Ain't about Blackwood anymore, little brother," Pete's voice carried clearly in the storm-washed air. "It's about family, and you just chose strangers over blood." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow, and Abigail saw 20 years of brotherly devotion crumble in the space between heartbeats. The young man who'd been wrestling with loyalty all morning suddenly looked older, harder, like he'd aged a decade in the span of a single conversation. "Maybe I did," Jake said quietly, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt. "Maybe that's what growing up looks like. Choosing what's right over what's easy." Iron Pete's laugh was ugly as a buzzard's cry. "Right? Boy, you don't know the meaning of the word. That schoolmarm's got you so twisted around you can't see straight." "Leave her out of this," Boaz warned, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart men step careful. "Your quarrel's with me, Pete Morrison, not with my wife." "Wife?" Pete spat into the mud. "She ain't nothing but a contract arrangement. You think that piece of paper makes her family?" "Blood is family, boy. Blood is all that matters in the end." The words hung in the storm-charged air like a challenge, and Abigail felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. 8 years of solitary teaching had taught her the value of chosen family over blood relations, and she'd be damned if she'd let a greedy rancher dismiss the bonds they'd forged in crisis. "You're wrong," she said, her voice cutting through wind and rain with surprising strength. "Blood might make you related, but loyalty makes you family. And Jake Morrison's shown more loyalty in one morning than you've shown in 20 years of raising him." Pete's face darkened with fury. "You got no right to speak about family, schoolmarm. You got no idea what sacrifice looks like." "Don't I?" Abigail's teacher authority kicked in like a reflex, the same tone she'd used to cow unruly children and uncertain parents. "I sacrificed 8 years of hoping for a family because I thought I wasn't worthy of one." "Jake's sacrificing his relationship with you because he knows right from wrong. What exactly have you sacrificed, Mr. Morrison, besides your integrity for Marcus Blackwood's silver?" The question hit home like a rifle shot, and Pete's hand dropped to his gun with the speed of a man past the point of reasoning. "That's enough talk." What followed happened so fast that later, Abigail would have trouble separating individual moments from the deadly dance that unfolded on that narrow shelf of rock. Pete Morrison drew first, his hand moving with the practiced speed of a man who'd settled more than one dispute with hot lead. But Jake was faster, not by much, but enough. The younger Morrison's Colt cleared leather like lightning, and his first shot took his brother in the shoulder, spinning the bigger man around and sending his aim wide. Pete's return shot split rock inches from Jake's head, sending stone chips flying like shrapnel. "Damn you, boy. I raised you better than this." "You raised me to know right from wrong," Jake shouted back, tears mixing with rain on his young face. "But you forgot to follow your own lessons." Tom Brady tried to circle around behind Pete's men, but the narrow trail offered no room for maneuvering. Clara Santos proved she was her mother's daughter by putting a rifle bullet so close to one gunman's ear that he dove for cover rather than continue the fight. But it was Boaz who ended the standoff by doing something none of them expected. He holstered his gun and stepped into the open with his hands raised. "Enough!" His voice carried such authority that even Pete Morrison hesitated. "Pete, you want to settle this? Then settle it with me, man to man. Leave the boy out of it." "Boaz, no!" Abigail's protest was torn from her throat like a prayer, but her husband's eyes held the calm certainty of a man who'd finally found his path. "It's the only way, Abigail. This started with our father's quarrel, and it ends with us." Iron Pete Morrison looked at the man he'd considered a neighbor for 10 years, and something like respect flickered in his weathered features. "You got sand, Cutter. I'll give you that. And you got family loyalty, even if it's pointed in the wrong direction." Boaz's voice carried surprising gentleness. "But Jake's my family now too, Pete. Has been since the day I hired him. And family protects family." The standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight, with rain hammering down on them all like nature's own judgment. Below them, Copper Creek raged with the fury of unleashed waters, carrying away the debris of the mining camp and Marcus Blackwood's carefully laid plans. Then Jake Morrison did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He threw his gun into the mud between the two groups and stepped forward with empty hands. "I'm done choosing between you," he said, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Pete, you're my blood and I love you, but I won't help you steal from good folks or hurt innocent people. And Boaz, you've been more of a father to me than anyone since our daddy died. If that makes me a traitor to somebody, then I reckon I'll learn to live with it." The simple honesty in his words seemed to drain the fight out of Iron Pete Morrison like air from a punctured balloon. The big rancher looked at his younger brother, really looked at him, and saw not the boy he'd raised, but the man that boy had become. "Ah, hell, Jake," Pete said quietly, his gun hand dropping to his side. "What have we done to ourselves?" "Nothing that can't be undone," Maria Santos called out with the wisdom of someone who'd seen families tear themselves apart over pride and poverty. "But it's going to take more than stubbornness to fix what's broken." The moment of peace was shattered by the crack of a rifle from above them, Marcus Blackwood's voice carrying down from higher ground like the devil's own sermon. "How touching. A family reunion in the middle of a flood." His laughter echoed off canyon walls with ugly satisfaction. "But I'm afraid this little drama has gone on quite long enough." He stood on an outcropping 50 feet above them, flanked by the remnants of his hired army, and holding a rifle that was pointed directly at Abigail's heart. The rain had plastered his expensive clothes to his frame, making him look like a scarecrow dressed in silk, but his eyes held the cold fury of a man who'd watched his careful plans wash away with the flood. "You want to know about family loyalty?" Marcus shouted down at them. "My father built an empire that your people destroyed with lies and bullets. But empires can be rebuilt and debts can be collected, with interest." His rifle spoke thunder, and the bullet spanged off rock inches from where Abigail stood. She felt stone chips sting her cheek and realized with crystal clarity that Marcus Blackwood intended to murder them all rather than admit defeat. "Take cover!" Boaz roared, but the narrow shelf offered precious little protection from a man with high ground and a good rifle. It was Jake Morrison who saved them all by doing something completely insane. He grabbed a rope from his saddle and went over the edge of the cliff, rappelling down toward the raging creek below like a man possessed. "Jake!" Pete's anguished cry echoed off canyon walls. "What the hell are you doing?" "Getting us out of this," came the faint reply from below. "There's a cave down here, behind the waterfall. Used to hide in it when we was kids." Waterfall. Abigail looked over the edge and saw what Jake had remembered. Copper Creek normally fell 20 feet in a series of gentle cascades, but the flood had turned it into a thundering curtain of water that concealed the cave mouth behind it. "He's right," Tom Brady shouted over the storm. "I remember that cave. If we can get down there without drowning or getting shot," Boaz corrected grimly. But he was already rigging his own rope, his movements quick and sure despite the chaos around them. Marcus Blackwood's rifle cracked again, and this time the bullet took Tom Brady's hat clean off his head. "You're not going anywhere!" the madman screamed from above. "This ends here! This ends now!" But nature had other plans. The sound that had been growing in the background suddenly became a roar that drowned out even Marcus's fury. Somewhere upstream, the storm had broken a beaver dam or caused a landslide, and a second wall of water was rushing down Copper Creek like the fist of an angry god. "Move!" Boaz grabbed Abigail around the waist and swung her toward the rope. "Everyone down, now!" What followed was the longest 30 seconds of Abigail's life, sliding down a rain-slicked rope toward a cave mouth hidden behind a waterfall, while bullets whined overhead and a flash flood tried to sweep them all to kingdom come. Her teacher's skirts were no help at all, but her frontier stubbornness kept her hands locked on that rope, even when her shoulders screamed in protest. She hit the cave floor harder than intended, rolling across wet stone with bruises blooming like spring flowers. But she was alive. She was breathing, and when she looked around, she saw the others dropping into the cave behind her like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Jake Morrison helped his Uncle Hank to a dry spot near the back of the cave, the old man conscious now but moving like every bone in his body had been individually beaten. "Sorry, boss," Jake said to Boaz as the rancher landed beside them. "Should have told you about Pete's deal from the beginning." "Should've, could've, would've," Boaz replied with surprising gentleness. "What matters is you chose right when it counted." Iron Pete Morrison was the last one down, his big frame filling the cave mouth as he stared out at the raging water that had swallowed his brother's brave rescue. "Boy always was too damn noble for his own good," he muttered, but there was pride in his voice alongside the worry. Outside their shelter, they could hear Marcus Blackwood screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush, but his voice was growing fainter as the floodwater rose toward his position. The man who'd thought he could buy and steal his way to an empire was learning that some forces couldn't be purchased or intimidated. "How long do we wait?" Clara Santos asked, wringing water from her rebozo. "Till the water goes down," Maria answered practically. "Or till Blackwood runs out of ammunition, whichever comes first." Abigail settled against the cave wall beside her husband, feeling the adrenaline of the fight slowly drain away to leave exhaustion in its wake. But beneath the tiredness was something else, a fierce satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. "We survived," she thought with wonder. "All of us. Despite the betrayals and the bullets and the flood, we're still alive." "Abigail," Boaz said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "Back there, when you stood up to Pete about family, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." She looked at this man who'd offered her security and found herself wanting to offer him something in return. Not just partnership, but the kind of trust that could weather any storm. "Wasn't brave," she said, surprising herself with the truth. "Was just protecting what's mine. And you, Boaz Cutter, you're mine now, contract or no contract." His smile was like sunrise after a long night, and when he kissed her, their first real kiss as husband and wife, it tasted like rain and gunpowder and the promise of something worth fighting for. Outside the cave, Copper Creek raged with the fury of unleashed nature. washing away the debris of Marcus Blackwood's schemes and carrying the truth toward whatever justice the frontier could provide. They'd survived guns and flood, but the hardest wounds were still coming, the kind that bled trust instead of blood. The cave that had sheltered them from Marcus Blackwood's bullets became a confessional, where secrets bled out like water from a cracked dam, and by the time the rain stopped falling, nothing would ever be the same. They huddled around a small fire that Jake had coaxed to life using dry tinder from the cave's depths, the smoke finding its way out through cracks in the stone ceiling. Outside, Copper Creek still raged with diminished fury, but the worst of the flood had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and forever changed. Hank Morrison sat propped against the cave wall, his battered face illuminated by dancing flames as he nursed cracked ribs and a split lip that would leave permanent scars. But it was the pain in his rheumy eyes that cut deepest. The look of a man who'd carried a terrible burden for 20 years and finally felt it lifting from his shoulders. "Reckon it's time you all knew the whole truth," he said, his voice hoarse from Blackwood's rough treatment, but steady with the resolve of a man who'd run out of reasons to stay silent. About Thomas Cutter's death, about Jonathan Blackwood's murder, and about why the Morrison family's been keeping quiet all these years. Jake Morrison looked up from where he was tending the fire, his young face etched with lines too deep for his years. The choice he'd made on the cliff, family over blood, principle over loyalty, had aged him in ways that went beyond mere time. "Uncle Hank," he said quietly, "you don't have to—" "Yes, I do, boy." Hank's voice carried the authority of a patriarch who'd made his final decision. "Been protecting you and Pete from the truth long enough, but it's eating us all alive from the inside. Time to lance this wound proper, even if it hurts worse before it gets better." Abigail drew her damp shawl closer around her shoulders, feeling the weight of approaching revelation like a physical presence in the cave. Beside her, Boaz sat tense as a coiled spring, his weathered hands clenched into fists that spoke of 20 years of misdirected guilt finally finding a target. "Tell us," he said simply, and those two words carried more authority than any demand. Hank Morrison closed his eyes as if the memories were too painful to face directly. "I was 19 years old that October day in 1854, working as a hand for whoever would pay me $1 and a meal. Your daddy, Thomas, had hired me to help with the late branding, and I was grateful for the work." The fire crackled and spit, sending shadows dancing across weathered faces as an old man's voice carried them back through 2 decades of buried truth. Jonathan Blackwood came riding up to the branding site around noon, dressed in fancy clothes and riding a horse that cost more than most folks made in a year. He had papers with him, legal documents that he claimed proved him and Thomas were partners in the land grant. "Were they?" Tom Brady asked quietly from his position near the cave mouth, where he was keeping watch for any sign of Marcus's return. "Hell no." Hank's voice carried the bitter certainty of an eyewitness. "Thomas Cutter never partnered with nobody. That man was independent as a hog on ice, and twice as stubborn. He worked that land with his own hands, paid for it with his own sweat, and he'd have died before giving Jonathan Blackwood so much as a square foot of it." Which is exactly what happened, Abigail thought with sick understanding. "Blackwood tried sweet talk first," Hank continued, his voice growing stronger as the story poured out of him. "Offered Thomas partnership terms, promised him wealth beyond his dreams if he'd just sign the papers. When that didn't work, he tried threats, said he had connections in the territorial government, lawyers who could make Thomas's life mighty difficult. And when threats didn't work," Boaz's question came out rough as sandpaper, "that's when Jonathan Blackwood showed his true colors." Hank opened his eyes, and the pain in them was 20 years deep. He told Thomas that accidents happened to stubborn men who didn't know when to be reasonable. Said it would be a shame if something happened to his boy. To you, Boaz, while Thomas was out working alone on the range. The cave fell silent except for the whisper of dying flames and the distant rumble of receding floodwater. Abigail felt rage building in her chest like pressure in a steam kettle. Rage at a dead man's threats against a child. Rage at 20 years of an innocent man carrying guilt that was never his to bear. "He threatened me," Boaz said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "Threatened to hurt a 13-year-old boy to get his daddy's land," Hank confirmed with disgust that had festered for 2 decades. That's when Thomas lost his temper. Drew on Blackwood right there in front of God and everybody, told him to get off Cutter land and never come back or face the consequences. But Blackwood was faster? Jake asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Blackwood was a coward. Hank spat into the fire, making it hiss like an angry snake. When Thomas turned to walk away, when he thought the matter was settled, Jonathan Blackwood shot him in the back. 3 times. Center mass. Killed him dead, and then stood over the body like he was checking his handiwork. The words hit the cave like thunderclaps, each one driving home the reality of cold-blooded murder disguised as frontier justice. Abigail watched her husband's face transform as 20 years of self-blame finally found its proper target. "Why didn't you tell someone?" Maria Santos asked from where she sat with Clara, mother and daughter holding each other against the weight of revealed truth. "Why didn't you go to the territorial marshal?" Hank's laugh was bitter as wormwood tea. "With what proof? My word against a rich Eastern man with political connections and a pocket full of forged documents. Hell, girl, I was lucky Blackwood didn't put a bullet in me too, just for witnessing his crime." "But he let you live," Tom Brady observed. "Why?" "Because he needed me alive to spread his version of the story." Hank's voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent 20 years living with compromise. "Told me if I kept my mouth shut about what really happened, he'd make sure my family was taken care of. Said if I ever talked, he'd hunt down every Morrison in the territory and make them pay for my loose tongue." Fear, Abigail realized. 20 years of fear keeping good people silent while a murderer's son built his plans on lies. "So you let folks believe Thomas died in an accident," Boaz said, and there was no accusation in his voice, just the flat statement of a man understanding the impossible choices others had been forced to make. "Let folks believe what they wanted to believe," Hank corrected. "Never said it was an accident, never said it wasn't. Just let the story tell itself while I kept my family safe and tried to live with the knowledge that a good man had died for his principles while I compromised mine to stay breathing." Jake Morrison's shoulders shook with emotion. Whether rage or sorrow or relief, Abigail couldn't tell. That's why Pete got so deep with Marcus Blackwood. The guilt's been eating at him too, hasn't it? All these years, knowing the truth but not being able to act on it. Your brother's always been the type to think he could fix things through action instead of patience, Hank said gently. When Marcus came offering a chance to profit from the secret instead of just carrying it, I think Pete saw it as a way to balance the scales, make the Blackwood money work for Morrison interests instead of against them. "But that would mean betraying Boaz," Abigail said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "Helping Marcus steal land that rightfully belonged to Thomas Cutter's son." Pete convinced himself it was justice, Jake said quietly. Said if the Blackwoods profited from murder, then at least the Morrisons should get something for keeping quiet about it all these years. The moral complexity of it all made Abigail's head spin like a child's top. Victim and witness, murderer and heir, silence and complicity. 20 years had tangled the threads of right and wrong until even good people couldn't see their way clear to justice. "But you never believed that," she said to Jake, and it wasn't a question. "Never sat right with me," he admitted. "Boaz treated me fair from the day he hired me, trusted me with his stock and his land and his life. How could I repay that by helping thieves and liars steal what was his by right?" "You couldn't," Boaz said simply, "which is why you chose the way you did when the shooting started." The sound of a horse splashing through receding floodwater brought all conversation to a halt. Tom Brady moved to the cave mouth, rifle ready, while the others prepared for whatever new threat was approaching their temporary shelter. "Hello, the cave!" The voice that called out was familiar, but unexpected. Iron Pete Morrison, alone and riding slow with his hands visible and empty. "Jake." "You in there, boy?" "I'm here, Pete," Jake called back, but his voice carried wariness along with relief. "What do you want?" "To talk." Pete's voice echoed off wet stone and rushing water. "To make things right before it's too late." There was something in his tone, a desperate sincerity that cut through the family conflict like a knife through butter. Jake looked to Boaz for permission, received a curt nod, and moved toward the cave mouth. "Come on in, brother," he called. "But come slow, and keep your hands where we can see them." Iron Pete Morrison entered the cave like a man walking into church, hat in hand, eyes downcast, moving with the careful humility of someone who knew he'd sinned and was hoping for forgiveness. Water dripped from his clothes to pool on stone, but it was the tears on his weathered cheeks that caught everyone's attention. "Uncle Hank," he said quietly, dropping to one knee beside the injured man. "I'm sorry." "God help me. I'm so damn sorry for what I've done." "Pete," Hank started, but his nephew cut him off with a gesture. "No, let me say this while I still got the courage." Pete's voice shook with emotion that 20 years of frontier hardness couldn't quite suppress. "I took Blackwood's money, I betrayed good neighbors, and I damn near got my own brother killed for 30 pieces of silver. But when I saw you fall from that cliff, Jake, when I thought I'd lost you forever—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The pain in his voice said everything that words couldn't carry. "I ain't dead, Pete," Jake said gently, moving to his brother's side. "Bruised and battered, but still breathing. Because you chose right when I chose wrong." Pete's admission came out like confession under torture. "Because you remembered what Daddy taught us about standing up for folks who can't stand up for themselves." "What happened to Marcus?" Abigail asked, practical concerns overriding family drama. "Where is he now?" Pete's face hardened with disgust. "Last I saw, he was riding hell-bent for leather toward the territorial capital, screaming about bringing federal marshals back to settle this legal matter properly. Man's convinced himself that money and paperwork can undo what nature and justice done to his plans." "He'll be back," Tom Brady said grimly. "Men like Marcus Blackwood don't give up easy, especially when their family pride's at stake." "Then we'll be ready for him," Boaz said with quiet certainty. "All of us. Together." The word hung in the cave like a promise. Together, not just husband and wife bound by contract, but a community united by shared trials and common purpose. Morrison and Cutter, Santos and Brady, old-timer and newcomer, all choosing cooperation over conflict, truth over comfortable lies. But even as they planned their united defense, none of them suspected that Marcus Blackwood's retreat was strategic rather than final, and that the worst betrayals were yet to come from directions they'd never thought to guard against. Trust, once broken, didn't mend easy, but sometimes broken things, welded back together in fire, proved stronger than they'd ever been whole. Dawn came to Red Fern Ridge like a promise of redemption, painting the flood-washed valley in shades of gold and amber that made even the scars look beautiful. But for Boaz Cutter, standing beside his father's grave with his hat in his hands, and 20 years of guilt finally lifting from his shoulders, the sunrise felt more like resurrection than just another day. "Sorry it took me so long to understand, Daddy," he said quietly, his voice meant for Thomas Cutter's weathered headstone and his own troubled conscience. "Spent all these years thinking I failed you when you were already gone, but I reckon I know better now." The cemetery sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, and from here Boaz could see the Cutter Ranch spread out below him, his ranch, earned through his father's honest sweat and defended through his own determination. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind rich soil and the promise of good grass come spring, life continuing despite the attempts of dead men's greed to poison it. You ain't failed nobody, son. Boaz turned to find Iron Pete Morrison approaching through the morning mist, his big frame moving with the careful humility of a man seeking forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. Pete's clothes were still damp from yesterday's flood, and his weathered face showed the kind of exhaustion that came from wrestling with conscience all night long. Pete, Boaz nodded, neither welcoming nor dismissive. Didn't expect to see you here. Figured it was time I paid my respects to the man my silence helped keep unavenged. Pete removed his own hat, revealing gray hair that seemed to have multiplied overnight. Thomas Cutter was a good man, and he deserved better than what he got from the Blackwoods and the Morrisons both. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two ranchers who'd spent years as wary neighbors finally finding common ground in shared understanding of old injustices. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth and new beginnings, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was singing like hope itself had found its voice. Jake told me about your daddy's letter, Pete said eventually. About the threats against you, about Thomas knowing his life was in danger. Makes a man wonder what kind of evil it takes to threaten a child to get what you want. The kind of evil that breeds true, Boaz replied, thinking of Marcus Blackwood's cold eyes and predatory smile. Jonathan's boy's got the same poison in his veins, just dressed up in fancy education and legal papers. Pete nodded grimly. Which is why I rode over here this morning with more than just apologies on my mind. Marcus ain't done with us, Boaz. Not by a long shot. Figured as much. Man like that don't give up easy when his pride's at stake. It's more than pride now. Pete's voice carried the weight of inside knowledge. Before the flood scattered his hired guns, I heard him talking to one of his men about bringing federal authority into this. Territorial marshals, circuit judges, maybe even military if he can convince them this is a matter of law and order. The implications of that statement settled over Boaz like a cold fog. Marcus Blackwood had money, education, and Eastern connections, exactly the kind of resources that could turn a local dispute into a federal case, with himself cast as the innocent victim of frontier lawlessness. How long you figure we got? Boaz asked. Week, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Time enough to get our stories straight and our defenses ready. Pete's weathered face was grim as winter stone. But Boaz, there's something else. Something I should have told you yesterday but couldn't find the courage for. More secrets. Boaz felt his stomach tighten like a fist. What kind of something? The kind that might get us all hanged if Marcus plays his cards right. Pete's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. When I was working with Blackwood, planning ways to discredit your daddy's claim, we discussed making it look like you and your people were the real criminals in this situation. How? The question came out sharper than Boaz intended. Cattle theft, land jumping, maybe even suggestions that you knew about your daddy's partnership with Jonathan Blackwood and killed the man to keep the secret buried. Pete's admission came out like confession under torture. Marcus has been collecting evidence for months, convenient witnesses, forged documents, anything that could paint you as the villain instead of the victim. The morning sun suddenly felt less warm on Boaz's shoulders. You helped him plan this? God help me, I did. Pete's voice cracked with shame. Thought I was just discussing possibilities, never imagining he'd actually... But a man desperate enough to kidnap and murder ain't gonna stop at perjury and fraud. No, Boaz agreed quietly. He ain't. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, Jake Morrison and Tom Brady riding up the cemetery path with expressions that suggested more bad news on the horizon. Behind them came Maria and Clara Santos, their faces set in lines of grim determination. Boss, Jake called out as he dismounted. We got problems. What kind of problems? Boaz asked, though he suspected he already knew. The kind that ride fast and carry federal badges, Tom Brady answered grimly. Just got word from the telegraph office in town. Marcus Blackwood's been busy overnight. Sent messages to the territorial capital claiming he's been the victim of armed assault by a gang of claim jumpers and murderers. Murderers? Pete's voice carried sick understanding. Claims we killed his father's business partner 20 years ago to steal land that rightfully belonged to the Blackwood estate, Tom continued. Says he's got witnesses and documentation to prove the whole thing. Maria Santos dismounted with the fluid grace of a woman who'd been riding horses since before she could walk properly. It gets worse, she said, her accented English carrying worry that went bone deep. My cousin works for the telegraph office. She says Blackwood's also claiming we kidnapped and tortured his elderly witness to force false confessions. Hank. The pieces clicked together in Boaz's mind with sickening clarity. Marcus was turning yesterday's rescue into today's crime, painting their desperate fight for survival as criminal assault on an innocent man. Where's Hank now? He asked. Safe at our place, Clara answered. Mama's tending his injuries and making sure he gets plenty of rest. But boss, the man's hurt bad. Broken ribs, possible concussion. If federal marshals show up wanting to question him, he might not be strong enough to tell his story properly, Boaz finished with growing dread. And an injured witness with a confused story would play right into Marcus's hands, especially if that witness was related to men already painted as criminals. There's more, Jake said quietly. Word's going around town that Marcus is offering rewards for information about our criminal activities. $500 for anyone who can provide evidence of cattle theft, land fraud, or violent assault. $500. In a territory where most folks were lucky to see $50 cash money in a year, that kind of reward could buy a lot of convenient testimony from desperate people. So what do we do? Clara asked, her young voice steady despite the magnitude of the threats arrayed against them. Boaz looked around at the faces gathered in the cemetery. Jake Morrison, who'd chosen principle over blood family. Iron Pete Morrison, who was trying to atone for months of wrong choices. Tom Brady, who wore his deputy's badge like a shield against injustice. Maria and Clara Santos, who'd risked everything to help neighbors they barely knew. Community. That's what they were now, bound together by shared crisis and common purpose, stronger than any legal document or blood relation. We tell the truth, he said simply. All of it. The whole story. From Jonathan Blackwood's murder of my daddy to Marcus's threats against innocent folks. We get it all written down proper, witnessed and notarized, so when the federal marshals show up, they'll have more than Marcus's bought testimony to consider. Truth's a fine thing, Pete said carefully, but it don't always win against money and political connections. Marcus has resources we can't match. Maybe. Abigail's voice came from behind them, clear and strong in the morning air. They turned to see her walking up the cemetery path, her teacher's skirts practical as always, but her bearing transformed by yesterday's trials into something harder and more determined. But Marcus Blackwood's never faced down a frontier community that's decided it's had enough of his family's lies, she continued, moving to stand beside Boaz with the natural grace of a woman who'd found her place in the world. And he's never dealt with folks who'd rather die honest than live as thieves. Abigail's right, Maria said with fierce pride. Red Fern Ridge has been home to honest people for 20 years. We won't let one man's greed destroy what we've built together. Then we make our stand here, Boaz decided, feeling the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Not just for the land, but for the principle of the thing. Some things are worth fighting for, and justice is one of them. Tom Brady's badge caught the morning light as he straightened to his full height. Speaking as the law in this territory, I'll need to take statements from all of you. Official testimony that can stand up against whatever lies Marcus brings back with him. And I'll need to make things right with folks I wronged, Pete added with grim determination. There's ranchers and businessmen in town who trusted my word when I was pushing Marcus's version of events. Time they heard the real story from someone who knows better now. Jake Morrison stepped forward with the resolve of a young man who'd finally found his path through a maze of impossible choices. And I'll ride to the territorial capital myself, carry Uncle Hank's written testimony to the marshals before Marcus can poison their minds with his lies. Too dangerous, Boaz protested. If Marcus sees you, then he sees me. Jake cut him off with surprising authority. But I've been running from hard choices long enough. Time I stood up and faced whatever consequences come from doing right. The plan that emerged from their cemetery council was simple in its honesty and dangerous in its execution. They would document every detail of the Blackwood conspiracy, gather supporting testimony from anyone willing to speak truth regardless of the personal cost, and prepare to defend their community against whatever force Marcus brought back to Red Fern Ridge. But as they prepared to ride down into the valley and begin their desperate race against federal authority, none of them noticed the lone figure watching from the ridge above, one of Marcus Blackwood's surviving hired guns, sent back to observe and report on their activities. The trap was already closing around them, and the man who'd inherited a murderer's greed was about to discover that sometimes the best weapon against truth was not lies, but the selective application of legal authority by men who cared more about politics than justice. Come dawn, Red Fern Ridge would learn what frontier justice looked like when good folks decided they'd had enough. But first, they'd have to survive one more night of Marcus Blackwood's cunning. Marcus Blackwood returned to Red Fern Ridge 3 days later with the federal authority he'd promised, and the kind of cold fury that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. But what he found waiting for him on Main Street wasn't the scattered, demoralized community he'd expected. It was something that would haunt his nightmares for whatever time he had left on this earth. The entire town had turned out. Every man, woman, and child who could walk had gathered in the muddy street outside the territorial courthouse, standing shoulder to shoulder in the October cold, like an army of ordinary folks who'd decided they'd heard enough lies for one lifetime. Shopkeepers stood beside ranchers, Mexican settlers beside Anglo farmers, old-timers beside newcomers, all united by the simple principle that some things were worth fighting for, and truth was one of them. Abigail Cutter stood at the front of the crowd, her teacher's authority transformed into something harder and more dangerous by 3 days of preparation and a lifetime of protecting what mattered most. Beside her, Boaz carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd finally stopped running from his father's legacy and started living up to it. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out, as Marcus dismounted from his expensive horse, flanked by 2 federal marshals whose badges caught the pale sunlight like warnings. "Welcome back to Red Fern Ridge. I trust your trip to the territorial capital was educational." Marcus's smile was all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a predator who thought he'd cornered his prey at last. "Indeed it was, Mrs. Cutter. Quite educational. Deputy Marshal Harrison, Deputy Marshal Webb, these are the criminals I've been telling you about." The federal marshals were cut from different cloth than Tom Brady, harder men with dead eyes and reputations for solving problems with lead when law failed to provide satisfaction. But even they seemed taken aback by the size and determination of the crowd facing them. "That's a mighty serious accusation, Mr. Blackwood," Deputy Marshal Harrison said carefully, his weathered hand resting easy on his gun butt. "You sure you want to make it in front of all these witnesses?" "Absolutely certain." Marcus's voice carried the confidence of a man who thought he held all the winning cards. "These people have been systematically terrorizing my family's legitimate business interests, up to and including the kidnapping and torture of an elderly witness. That witness being Henry Morrison," Marshal Webb consulted his notes with professional thoroughness, "who you claim can testify to criminal conspiracy dating back 20 years. Among other things, yes." Marcus's pale eyes fixed on Jake Morrison, who stood with his Uncle Hank near the courthouse steps. The old man was still battered from his ordeal, but his spine was straight as a lodgepole pine, and his voice was ready to tell truth to whoever had ears to hear it. "Well then," Marshal Harrison said with the weary patience of a man who'd seen too many territorial disputes turn ugly. "Suppose we hear from Mr. Morrison himself about these alleged crimes." "Be my pleasure," Hank said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "Been waiting 20 years to tell this story to folks with the authority to do something about it." What followed was the most important 15 minutes in Red Fern Ridge's history, an old man's testimony that transformed Marcus Blackwood from a grieved victim to heir of a murderer, witnessed by 2 federal marshals and a town full of people who'd staked their lives on the power of truth. Hank Morrison told it all. Jonathan Blackwood's threats against a 13-year-old boy, Thomas Cutter's principled refusal to be intimidated, the cold-blooded murder disguised as self-defense, and 20 years of enforced silence bought with fear and threats of retribution. When he finished, the street was quiet as a graveyard except for the whisper of wind through bare trees and the sound of Marcus Blackwood's world collapsing around his ears. "Interesting story," Marshal Webb said finally. "But it's still one man's word against legal documentation. Mr. Blackwood, you have papers supporting your claim?" "Of course." Marcus produced his sheaf of forged documents with hands that shook slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "Partnership agreements, surveying records, correspondence between my father and Thomas Cutter, all properly witnessed and notarized." "By clerks who've been dead for 15 years, Maria Santos called out from the crowd, her voice carrying the sharp satisfaction of a woman who'd done her homework. "Clerks whose signatures don't match their official records at the territorial office." Marcus went pale as fresh snow. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that my daughter Clara spent the last 3 days in the territorial capital, comparing your evidence to the official records," Maria continued with growing confidence. "Amazing what a young woman with good handwriting and better manners can discover when she sets her mind to it." Clara Santos stepped forward from the crowd, her arms full of official documents that carried the territorial seal. The clerks who supposedly witnessed these partnership agreements were named William Foster and James McCready, but according to territorial employment records, William Foster died in 1859 and James McCready was transferred to Colorado Territory in 1857, 3 years before your father allegedly signed these papers. The implications hit Marcus like physical blows, and Abigail watched 20 years of careful planning crumble like a house built on sand. But instead of surrender, she saw something uglier flicker in his pale eyes, the desperate fury of a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. "Clever," he said quietly, his cultured voice taking on undertones that made smart folks step back. "Very clever indeed. But I'm afraid you've overlooked one small detail." His hand moved toward his coat with calculated slowness, and Abigail felt ice form in her stomach as she realized what was coming. He's not here to win in court anymore. He's here to finish what his daddy started. "Mr. Blackwood," Marshal Harrison warned, his own hand dropping to his weapon, "I'd advise against any sudden movements." "Would you?" Marcus's smile was like winter death. "Even when I'm simply reaching for additional evidence?" But what came out of his coat wasn't papers. It was a nickel-plated revolver that gleamed like silver justice in the pale sunlight. "You want the truth about my father's death? Here's the truth. Jonathan Blackwood was murdered by Thomas Cutter in cold blood, and his son has been living on stolen land ever since." The lie was so brazen, so completely opposite to the truth they'd all just heard, that for a moment the street fell silent with shock. Then Iron Pete Morrison's voice cut through the quiet like a blade through silk. "That's enough, Blackwood!" Pete stepped out of the crowd with his own gun drawn, but his attention was fixed on something beyond Marcus, movement in the alley beside the general store where more of Blackwood's hired guns were positioning themselves for a massacre. "You brought more than marshals back with you," Pete observed grimly. Brought enough firepower to wipe out this whole town if you don't get your way. Marcus's laugh was ugly as a buzzard's cry. Insurance, Mr. Morrison, in case frontier justice proved insufficiently cooperative. That's when Tom Brady made his choice between federal authority and local truth. Marshals, he called out, his deputy's badge catching sunlight like a beacon. You might want to look around before you decide which side of this fight deserves your support. Marshal Harrison and Marshal Webb were professional lawmen, trained to read situations that could turn deadly without warning. They saw the hired guns positioning themselves, saw Marcus Blackwood's desperate fury, saw a community united in defense of something worth protecting. Mr. Blackwood, Marshal Harrison said with deadly quiet, I believe you've misrepresented the nature of this dispute. Have I? Marcus's voice was rising toward hysteria. These people are criminals, murderers. They killed my father and stole his land. Your father killed Thomas Cutter, Boaz said with the calm certainty of a man who'd finally found peace with 20 years of guilt. Shot him in the back like a coward, then spent 20 years building lies on top of murder. And you inherited more than his money, Marcus. You inherited his evil. The words hit their target like bullets, and Marcus Blackwood's last thread of sanity snapped like an overstretched wire. Then I'll finish what he started. His gun swung toward Abigail with lethal intent, and time slowed to honey-thick moments that would replay in nightmares for years to come. She saw death in his pale eyes, saw her husband reaching for his own weapon, saw federal marshals drawing their guns in professional response to a threat gone wildly out of control. But it was Jake Morrison who ended it all, the young man who'd spent days choosing between impossible loyalties, finally making the choice that mattered most. His bullet took Marcus Blackwood's center mass, spinning the would-be murderer around and sending his shot wild into the mud of Main Street. Marcus fell like a broken puppet, his expensive clothes finally as muddy and common as any frontier corpse. With his last breath, he whispered words that carried 20 years of inherited hatred. The land was ours. No, Abigail said quietly, kneeling beside the dying man, with the compassion that frontier life couldn't quite strip from a teacher's heart. It never was. It belonged to folks who worked it honest and defended it with their lives. Your daddy forgot that. Don't make the same mistake in whatever comes next. Marcus Blackwood died with his pale eyes fixed on the community that had defeated him, and his final expression was one of frustrated disbelief that ordinary people could triumph over money and legal manipulation through the simple expedient of standing together when it mattered most. The frontier had taught Red Fern Ridge that justice wasn't always what came from courtrooms and legal papers. Sometimes it was what good folks made with their own hands when truth and law finally stood on the same side. Spring came early to Red Fern Ridge that year, as if the land itself was eager to wash away the last traces of winter's violence and Marcus Blackwood's inherited evil. The snow melted clean and clear, feeding Copper Creek with honest water that ran transparent as truth over stones polished smooth by time and persistence. Abigail Cutter stood in the doorway of what had been the schoolhouse and was now something else entirely. A home, built from the foundation of a marriage contract, but strengthened by shared trials until it could weather any storm the frontier might bring. Through the windows, she could see Boaz working in the garden they'd planted together, his movements easy and content in a way she'd never seen during those first tense days of their arrangement. Hard to believe it's only been 6 months, she said to Maria Santos, who was helping her arrange furniture in what would soon become a nursery. The older woman's smile was warm as summer sunshine, and her hands were gentle as she folded tiny quilts that spoke of hope made manifest. Time moves different when you're living instead of just surviving, Maria replied with the wisdom of someone who'd seen both kinds of existence. You and Boaz, you've built something worth building on, something that'll last longer than the both of you. Abigail's hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly, where new life was growing like a promise of better tomorrows. The child would be born in autumn, September, if her calculations were correct, and would grow up knowing stories of courage and community instead of fear and isolation. "You think the little one will understand?" she asked quietly. "About their grandfather? About Marcus Blackwood? About all the violence that came before?" "They'll understand what matters," Maria assured her. "That their daddy and mama stood up for what was right when standing up was dangerous. That their community chose truth over comfort when the choice came calling. That's a legacy worth passing down." Through the window, they could see Jake Morrison riding up the path with the easy confidence of a young man who'd finally found his place in the world. The federal marshals had cleared him of any wrongdoing in Marcus Blackwood's death. Self-defense in protection of innocent lives, they'd ruled, and the entire community had testified to his courage when courage was called for. "Jake's looking better," Abigail observed. The haunted expression that had shadowed his face for months was gone, replaced by something steadier and more hopeful. "Man does better when he knows who he is and where he belongs," Maria agreed. "That boy's found his family, and it ain't just the one he was born to." Jake dismounted with a grin that transformed his young face, making him look more like the carefree youth he should have been instead of the guilt-ridden young man they'd first known. "Afternoon, ladies. Boss around?" "In the garden, arguing with tomato plants," Abigail replied, with the fond exasperation of a woman who'd learned that her practical husband had an unexpectedly romantic soul when it came to growing things. "Good. Got news from town that'll make him smile." Jake's expression grew more serious, but it was the gravity of important business rather than the weight of terrible secrets. Federal marshals finished their investigation. Marcus Blackwood's forged documents are officially documented as fraud. The territorial court has validated your daddy's original land grant, and there ain't gonna be any more questions about who owns what around here. Relief washed over Abigail like cool water on a hot day. The legal uncertainty that had shadowed their marriage from its very beginning was finally, officially resolved. The land was theirs, the marriage was real, and the future was whatever they chose to make of it. "What about Iron Pete?" she asked. "Any word about charges against him for his part in Marcus's schemes?" Jake's face clouded slightly. "Marshals decided his cooperation in exposing the fraud outweighed his initial involvement. He's got to make restitution to folks he misled, and he's lost some standing in the community, but he ain't going to prison. Pete's working hard to rebuild trust, and I think we're gonna be all right as brothers." The relief in his voice was palpable. Family reconciliation was never easy, but Jake and Pete Morrison had found their way back to each other through shared commitment to doing better. It was a healing that would take time, but the foundation was solid. "And Hank?" Maria asked. "Uncle Hank's tougher than old leather and twice as stubborn," Jake grinned. "Doctor says he'll be good as new in another month or two. Already talking about writing down his memoirs. Says the territory needs an honest record of what really happened in the early days." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road, where Tom Brady was riding toward the house with official dispatch pouches that meant news from the territorial capital. But his expression was relaxed rather than urgent, suggesting good news rather than new troubles. "Tom," Abigail called out as the deputy dismounted, "what brings you out our way?" "Official business," he replied with mock solemnity, producing a document with an impressive territorial seal. "Governor's office wanted to personally commend the citizens of Red Fern Ridge for their exemplary cooperation with federal authorities in exposing criminal conspiracy and territorial fraud. Seems our little community has become something of a model for how law and justice can work together when good folks stand up for what's right." "Fancy words for doing what needed doing," Jake observed with a grin. "Fancy words that come with a reward," Tom corrected, producing a bank draft that made everyone's eyes widen. Territorial treasuries offering compensation for damages suffered during the Blackwood conspiracy, plus a bounty for exposing federal crimes. Comes to near $2,000, to be distributed among the affected parties. $2,000. Abigail's mind reeled at the sum, more money than most frontier families saw in 5 years of hard work, and enough to secure their community's future in ways that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "What'll you do with your share?" Maria asked. Abigail looked out at the garden where her husband was coaxing life from Wyoming soil, then at the nursery where her child would sleep safe and warm, then at the faces of friends who'd become family through trials that had tested them all. "Build," she said simply. "Build a school that's worthy of the children who'll learn in it. Build a community that's strong enough to protect what matters. Build a future that's worth the price we paid for it." Boaz appeared in the doorway at that moment, his hands still dirty from honest work, and his eyes bright with contentment that 6 months of marriage had deepened rather than diminished. "What's all the commotion about?" he asked, moving to stand beside his wife with the natural ease of a man who'd found his proper place in the world. "Good news, mostly," Abigail replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "And plans for the future." "Future sounds good to me," he said quietly, his hand finding hers with the certainty of a promise kept and another one being made, especially when it includes you and whatever else Providence sees fit to bless us with. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of their transformed home, Abigail Cutter, no longer the lonely schoolteacher who'd signed a marriage contract out of desperation, but a frontier woman who'd helped defend her community against inherited evil, felt something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Peace. Not the peace of resignation or compromise, but the peace that came from fighting for something worth protecting and discovering that you were stronger than you'd ever imagined. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle drops that would feed the garden and fill the creek and wash the world clean for whatever challenges and joys the future might bring. And in the distance, barely audible over the whisper of rain on roof shingles, came the sound of children playing, the next generation of Red Fern Ridge, growing up free and safe because their parents had chosen courage over comfort when the choice came calling. The contract had brought them together, but it was the fight for home that made them family, and family, as they'd learned, was worth any price the frontier demanded. Y'all, this here tale grabbed hold of my heart like a winter wind and wouldn't let go, no matter how hard I tried to shake free of its grip. When I first set out to tell Abigail and Boaz's story, I reckoned it'd be a simple thing. Practical woman needs security, honest man needs help. Frontier arrangement that makes sense to both parties. But the West don't deal in simple, and neither do the human hearts beaten in the middle of it. What struck me deepest was watching trust grow between two souls who started with nothing but ink on paper and a handshake deal. Abigail and Boaz didn't have pretty words or moonlight serenades. They had winter-comin' enemies gathering and a whole passel of folks determined to take what little they'd managed to build. But when Marcus Blackwood's inherited greed came knockin' with guns and lawyers, that's when a marriage contract became something real and lasting. The redemption running through this story cuts deeper than just Jake Morrison choosing principle over blood, or Boaz finding peace with his daddy's death. It's about an entire community learning that home ain't just the dirt under your boots. It's the folks willing to bleed beside you when trouble comes riding. Maria Santos risking everything for neighbors she barely knew. Iron Pete Morrison choosing truth over profit. Even old Hank spilling 20 years of painful secrets to see justice done. That's the real frontier spirit that built this country, one honest choice at a time. Greed'll plant you 6 feet under sure as winter kills the grass, but trust earned through shared hardship. That'll carry you through to spring and beyond. Marcus Blackwood had money, education, and his daddy's inheritance of lies, but he couldn't stand against neighbors who'd decided their fight was stronger together than apart. Trust's scarcer than honest politicians and twice as valuable. But when you find it, when you earn it through kept promises and shared danger, it's worth more than all the forged deeds and stolen land in the whole territory. Abigail and Boaz learned that love ain't always gentle touches and whispered endearments. Sometimes it's handing someone a loaded rifle and knowing they'll guard your back when hell comes calling. The frontier's a hard teacher, but it makes hard people, and hard people who choose to trust each other despite the world's cruelty. Well, that's about the strongest force this old Earth's ever seen. Even in dust and blood, hope flickers like a campfire that won't be extinguished, lighten the way for whatever comes next. Thanks for riding this trail with me, for letting these characters live and breathe in your hearts while their story played out across Red Fern Ridge's unforgiving landscape. What lesson from Red Fern Ridge hit you hardest? Was it Jake's choice between blood and principle? Or maybe Abigail's transformation from protected to protector? Comment below with what stirred your soul, drop an icon if this tale of frontier justice moved you, and follow for more stories where ordinary folks do extraordinary things when courage calls their names.